I am truly delighted to be launching our first like I'm a captain of a ship, the first panel of the symposium, and I think like the rest of the symposium, this is going to be very special. What we're going to be doing is discussing the vitally important, and I think a role it's important that it's acknowledged, is the vitally important role that the Jackson Hyman family has played in fostering public and critical recognition of Shirley Jackson's work. So we are really honoured and very, very delighted to have with us here today, not one, not two, but four members of the Jackson Hyman family. We have Shirley's sons, Laurence and Barry, and two of her grandchildren, Miles and Gretchen. So I'd like to welcome them and thank them so much for taking the time and to work across various time zones, etc., to be with us here today. I'll just take a brief moment. Hi, Barry. I'll take a brief moment welcome Barry. Hi, Barry. Good to see you.
Hello.
We have Gretchen. Hi, Gretchen. Wonderful to see you too.
Hello.
We will have Laurence and Miles joining us in a second. Hi, Miles.
Hello.
Thank you so much. And
Thank
Laurence as well.
Can't get my video. There it goes.
Oh, brilliant. That's everybody. So I'm going to give a sort of an abbreviated sort of bio from everybody. You will find the full bios in the Discord, and the link to the bios is in the Discord as well, and will also be on our website. I'd like to remind the audience that there will be time for a Q&A about 15 minutes or so at the end. So feel free to ask any questions you might have in the chat, and hopefully we'll get to yours. So without further ado, then we'll start. Laurence, I think since you are the elder statesman of the Jackson siblings, if we start with you, I think Laurence, I know many people will be familiar with Laurence's work on editing Shirley's work, and of course her selected letters, product placement, very fine volume. Now, there we go. Gretchen's got it as well, available in all good bookshops and websites. Laurence is the eldest of Shirley's four children. He has managed the estate for almost 25 years, and he serves as executive producer on all film and TV and stage adaptations of her work, which I'd imagine is getting more and more busy by the moment. He was the editor, as I've said, of the Letters of Shirley Jackson, in consultation with Bernice Murphy, who I know, and she's an extremely difficult person. And he's a real piece of work. And he's co-edited 2 volumes of his mother's previously unpublished and uncollected works with his sister, Sarah. Thank you so much, Laurence. It's lovely to see you again and great to have you here today. Then we have Barry Hyman. Hi, Barry. Thank you so much.
Hello.
Barry performs, records, composes, and teaches music from his forest home in rural New York State. His website, www.barryhyman.com, has links to his audio and video recordings, and you will find that link on our Discord and on our website, and people will be able to follow up with that as well. We have then 2 of Shirley's grandchildren. We have, first of all, Gretchen Hyman. Thank you so much for taking the time to see us, Gretchen. It's lovely to meet you. Gretchen is a writer, editor, and content marketing executive specializing in content creation and editorial strategy, and currently serves as editorial director from InMobile, a leading provider of mobile monetization and marketing technologies. And I hope I didn't mangle that pronunciation too badly, Gretchen.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And then we have Miles Hyman. It's great to have you here, Miles. I think some of our audience may well be familiar with Miles's, apart from the other wonderful work he's done, his really beautifully rendered graphic novel adaptation of The Lottery, which is gorgeous. And if you don't have a copy, why not? It's a beautiful volume. So Miles is a multidisciplinary artist and author of graphic novels. His adaptations include novels by John Dos Passos, Joseph Conrad, Jules Verne, the great Shirley Jackson, of course, and James Ellroy. And he's shown his work in galleries in Paris, Brussels, Rome, Geneva, and New York. And in 2017, Miles, you were awarded a very prestigious French award. I'm going to mangle the pronunciation very badly because my French is terrible. Could you mind saying it out loud?
Chevalier des Arts et des Lettres.
Thank you so much. It was much better coming from you than coming from me. So without further ado, guys, let's get started. My first question then would be, how do you all know each other? Sorry.
Dad, you have to start with that one.
Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to see you all. This is the first time we've done a Zoom together, so this is
Oh,
this is
wow.
special.
This is an auspicious moment indeed.
Indeed, yes.
I mean, what I'd like to do first of all is I'd love to know if each of you have a particular Jackson work which is of particular significance to you or would be a personal favorite. If you could briefly mention what that might be. And maybe we'll start off. Laurence, would you mind kicking us off?
Sure. Well, it's hard because I love them all, but
Yeah.
I think the sundial would be the one I would choose as my favorite. It's certainly the funniest. It's the most horrifying. And I know that my mother particularly enjoyed writing it and reading from it. There are scenes in that book that I can remember my parents just roaring with laughter over as they read them together. In particular, a book burning scene, which occurs midway, and they're just throwing in all these wonderful volumes to clear the shelves in order to make room for canned food.
Okay.
It's great. It's a
A very
fabulous.
timely scene. Very timely.
Yes, it is.
I happened to teach it for the first time to my students last year, and it was during just after one of our many pandemic lockdowns, and it really resonated for many reasons.
It's very relevant
yeah.
these
Oh,
days.
Yes,
Hauntingly relevant.
Yeah, I mean, it's bizarre that it hasn't been adapted yet, really, isn't it? It just seems like such an obvious one to.
It is under option currently and is being adapted. So I'm hopeful that we can nudge that forward, as are many other properties.
It's been adapted, actually, but as an illustrated book. But a small press in San Francisco.
Yes,
right.
That looks
very
beautiful.
nice.
Yeah,
I
Miles
also, sorry, Dan.
yeah,
sorry.
Miles did the illustrations for that, and they're beautiful.
Oh,
They're-
fantastic. I didn't know that. That's brilliant.
Yeah, beautiful.
Sorry,
It was a
Gretchen.
small press.
I'm sorry, Gretchen, were you going to say the sundial as well? Was that?
No, I was going to echo my dad, Laurence, in saying that it's also one of my favorite properties. Absolutely. Just not only funny, but also quite disturbing. The characters are fascinating sort of archetypes, but it's grim. Wonderfully grim.
Yeah. And do you have a favorite apart from that, Gretchen?
There are just so many wonderful short stories. I would say Paranoia is one of my favorite short stories. I recently started reading 7 Types of Ambiguity the other day, really enjoying it. There are just so many. It's just a treasure trove.
Absolutely. You'll never run out of good Shirley Jackson, will you? I mean,
Never.
Yeah. Barry, what about yourself? Do you have a particular story that resonates?
I'm very attached to Mary Cat and We've Always Lived in the Castle.
Yeah, we've got her.
Yeah, I'm saying it in back of you, but it's I can relate. But also the summer people, and
Oh yes.
I think there was a whole collection of stories, some of her darker stories. I still live around that area where we lived when she was writing it. And it's very easy to relate to some of those stories, the summer people in particular.
Yes.
So I love it all, but the scary stories and Castle and Sundial are my favorites.
And I have a feeling too that in our next panel on folk horror, I have a feeling that the sundial will probably be mentioned quite a bit, because I think in retrospect, it's also been a very influential story as well. So
I've always understood that the sundial was Shirley's favorite, although that may be family mythology, rather, she can't tell us, but that had always been my memory.
Yeah, she did actually write that in her letters. She said many times that sundial was her favorite.
and she kept hoping it would be adapted, didn't she? She was hoping it would go onto the screen. Yeah.
I certainly hope we can come through on that soon. We're working on it.
Fingers crossed. And Miles, what about yourself? Do you have, I mean, you've obviously adapted the lottery and you've worked on the sundial, but was there anything else that has resonated with you?
As Barry said, the summer people. I have to admit that's really one of my favorites. I love her short fiction, perhaps more than the novels. And the summer people has always been. If I could adapt a second one as a graphic novel, I'd want to do that one for sure. There's so much. innuendo and suspense. The short stories where there's no real supernatural events, but everything is sort of contained within the human relationships and the tension within. Those are the ones that I find most powerful and the most evocative.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And that sounds like a potentially, if you were to adapt it, a really wonderful project. I'm sure you have enough on your plate already, but I mean, one thing that's sort of come up already, I think, is that you all work in very creative, literary, artistic, and musical fields as well. I mean, of course, Barry, you're a musician, and I know Laurence, you are a musician also. In terms of the fact that you are all inheritors in many senses of the word of Shirley Jackson's kind of literary and cultural legacy, what is that like? I mean, it must be in a way. I don't want to use the word burden, but there must be certain both privileges and almost incredible responsibilities that come with that for you all as members of the family.
Yeah, well, I feel a great deal of responsibility since managing her estate has become practically a full-time job. There's so much going on. Let me go back to the music for a second. What a lot of people don't know about our parents, and particularly our mother, is that she was very, very musical. She loved to sing. She played the guitar. She played the piano. And it was a big part of her life. My father, on the other hand, was not musical, but loved to listen to music. And we all, from the earliest ages, were exposed to a diverse amount of music: jazz, blues, classical music, folk music. Practically nothing was not played for us. I mean, we really had a very rich musical background, and it's an undertone in a lot of her writing as well. So I think that's a point that often is overlooked about them, but particularly Shirley.
Yeah,
absolutely, and such an important part of her. It's obviously something that really enriched her own life. And absolutely. Barry, I think you were about to interject there as well.
Well, going to your, you used the word burden. When I think of my mother's writing, it's a standard of excellence more than anything else. The quality of the editing, the removal of the superfluous, the purity of it, and so that's always been it's very easy for me to translate that to music and have that be a standard or a set of standards that one tries to live up to. You don't have to play any extra notes. If a note is implied, it doesn't have to be heard. Sometimes it's better that way. So it's a ferocious burden in that I don't feel, as an artist, and I have no excuse to be bad. That would be that would be laziness in editing. So it lights a fire under my butt, and it has for 60 years. Is the answer, Bernice?
That's a very good way of putting it. Thank you, Barry. And what about Miles and Gretchen? How do you find that experience of being part of this? Incredibly impressive lineage. And of course, Stanley was, of course, a very noted academic and critic and a very prominent figure himself. So, it's sort of a bit of a literary power couple, I suppose you could call them. Yeah,
indeed. Gretchen, do you want to?
No, I was trying to think of a response, really, and I just definitely not a burden, always something that I was in awe of, both of their works, Shirley Jackson and Stanley Edgar Hyman, and just proud to be part of that legacy, really. That would be sort of my response.
As far as my experience has been, it's true that up to the for most of my life, it's been a privilege to have that relationship with her work. The moment where I started to work actually in adapting her literary works into graphic novels, for instance, then the burden element started to come in, because I realized, exactly as Barry said, how high the standards were, how that incredible economy in her language had to be really respected in the way that you build images when you're illustrating her work. The superfluous has to be eliminated so we can focus on the essential elements in the narrative. And also in doing that work, you realize how important it is, how the element of what's invisible in her work is important. And when it comes to the work of then making that visible, there's a real challenge there, because you have to respect everything in her work that is not said, that remains silent, and which when you start to interpret that into images, you have to find ways of working with the contrast between what is visible and what's invisible, what is depicted and what's not depicted.
It kind of reminds me a little bit, without wanting to give a kicking to one of the less maybe artistically successful adaptations of Jackson's work, but a certain film adaptation that throws in things like decapitations and ghost children.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Illhouse. The 1999 version in particular I'm thinking of, where I think that precisely that kind of subtlety and ambiguity and the power of what's not shown as opposed to what is graphically described is sort of maybe not quite achieved. But that's a whole other panel topic.
Indeed.
Well, she was really a master at implying things without saying them, and often could create an entire picture without really describing it, but implying it. And I mean, let's face it, she wrote a ghost story where there are no ghosts.
Absolutely. And there's not many people that can get away with that. I think it's, even in The Turn of the Screw, it's a little bit more ambiguous in terms of the ghost, and there are kind of arguably ghostly figures there too. Barry, you were about to say?
In terms of the visual aspect that was not on her written page, I think Miles has always gotten that exactly right. In the Sundial book and also in the graphic novel of The Lottery. The images I saw reading my mother's books, Miles captured all that perfectly. The architecture, the people, the faces. I think she would have thought that was just right also.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
Bravo.
Thank you very much, Barry. And one thing is that as Jackson fans will be very well aware of, Barry, Laurence, your sisters Sally and Joanne, as kids they are celebrities. They're kind of they're the stars of the show, of the family stories, etc. So the kids of this, and I know, Laurence, we've talked about this before, that you guys as kids were obviously sort of transposed into these very popular stories. One thing too is that both Miles and Gretchen also make some appearances in the letters. I was looking over them as well, and I was sort of laughing. I was reminded of we have a footnote about you, Miles, and your nickname that Shirley gave you, which I hope I got this right. It was Big Mo when you were first born.
I
learned that in reading the letters. I didn't know.
Big Moe, and it's after my father's name, Mo.
He had recently deceased or died, hadn't he? Stanley's dad.
Correct.
And we also have there's a lovely note that Shirley wrote to her agent Carol only about a year or so before she died, where she says, "We have a new granddaughter, by the way, and all our maples have turned to gold," which I thought was a lovely, the mention of. So Gretchen, you're certainly in there too, and so I guess what I wanted to ask in a general sense is that. What is it like to have these kind of mentions of yourself? I mean, it must be slightly surreal, actually, in a way. I'm thinking particularly for the grandkids and the letters, there must be something, seeing this sort of private correspondence, in a sense, being out in the world as a correspondence of a major American writer, and yet it's your grandmother and you're there as well. And then maybe we can talk to Barry and Laurence after that about your more general experiences being, the Jackson Hyman kids as celebrities before that.
Well, Gretchen, did you want to?
No, go ahead.
I actually no, I think it's wonderful. I mean, even if they're brief mentions, it meant a lot to see how important our arrival in the family was for her, and that she seemed to be really pleased to have grandchildren. Yeah, no, just it means a lot, and it's part of the relationship that I've tried to build on. I only have really one memory of her sitting in her kitchen on a stool, which I've learned since was a spot that she spent a lot of time in at the end of the day. So seeing those letters was yet sort of another indication of that relationship, and it really means a lot.
Yeah, I agree. Seeing some of that mentioned in the letters was very touching. I don't have any memory. Dad, wasn't I just practically born at that point? I don't remember. I don't even think I was one. But still, the house in the town that we grew up in North Bennington was there, and it was always a reminder of their lives and and how they were part of that community. So it was always, even after Shirley passed and Stanley passed, it was still, they remained in that community and they were well known. And that was, as Miles has said, it was a real honor to be part of that.
And was there for either of you, I guess, was there always a kind of vague understanding in the background that your grandmother Shirley was also the writer Shirley Jackson, or was this something that was more of a general kind of realization? Or a more prolonged kind of realization.
For me, I didn't really fully start to realize that Shirley was a writer until around the time that Stanley, I was thinking about this morning, until the time that Stanley died, and then Shirley's book collection basically appeared in our house, and we sort of, as a family, refer to it as the murder collection. And I have it still to this day. It's a collection of books that were very important to her. And maybe Dad, you have some more insight there, but mostly cataloging some very famous murder trials. It's a fantastic collection of books. And at that point, I think I had a summer job cataloging the collection. And that's sort of when Shirley started to emerge in my young mind as someone who was really quite special and interesting.
In my case, I think one of the real key moments was when Dad, you sat us down. I think it was in Cole Street in San Francisco, and you read the short story Charles to us.
Yes.
And the link that was made between Shirley and then you as an actor in that story.
An alleged actor.
Yeah, an alleged actor. I'm sorry.
Wait a minute.
Were you guys at all disturbed by the Gothic twist at the end as to who Charles's identity was? Or
as a young person, I thought it was funny, and actually, I think it's actually the novel that the short story that mixes both genre that she worked in. Both sort of the more family-based light fiction, and then something that becomes suddenly a little darker in the end because you realize that there's this secret that's suddenly been divulged. Perhaps.
No, I've been asked all my life about that story, and I've never yet talked about it much.
Now's the time.
I fall back on what my mother used to say, which is, it's just a story. I grew up, being in stories. I mean, as far back as I can remember, my mother was writing stories about us children, and it just was part of my life. It never really seemed, it certainly didn't disturb me. In later years, I've come to wonder, though, how much of my childhood I really remember, or how much I remember the way Shirley wrote about it. Because really, most of the things she wrote about, or many of the things in Life Among the Savages and then Raising Demons, really happened, but of course they didn't happen quite that way. Shirley had a way of spinning things into wonderful stories. Even family catastrophes could become hilarious stories in her hands, and she was just remarkable at doing that. And again, I've been asked all my life about these stories, and there's not much to say. They exist in their own world.
Yeah, and I think too, again, in another bit of product placement, the letters I think are often really interesting in this sense, because you see that kind of the first draft of the family stories, particularly in the letters that she wrote to her parents, Leslie and Geraldine. I mean, Barry, you feature, there's one of the letters that makes me laugh so much every time I read it, where Shirley's trying to write a letter to her agent, I think, but she says Barry has magnetized the typewriter and there was a pair of scissors stuck to it or something, where you have been conducting some sort of science experiment as a precocious 8 or 9 year old. So, I mean, like Laurence as well, you obviously grew up with these stories being published, that in a way where, sort of as Laurence was indicating, a kind of a version of your childhood as it was ongoing. So how was that for you?
Well, it's funny that when I was growing up, Shirley Jackson was not that famous, not that successful. And yet in my family, I had been led to believe that my parents were really first rate, and my reading of their books seemed to be like that. And so in an odd sort of way, I was slightly, not ashamed, that's too strong a word, but I was not really proud of her humor. And to some extent, I thought then that a lot of that was written for money. I was much more proud of her, the darker things she wrote, because I thought she was making very profound statements about human nature that I think are why she's successful now. But so as she has become more successful and respected, I go back and look at the funny stuff and realize how good that was also. But when I was a kid, I didn't really take that seriously. And I don't think I ever really sat down and paid much attention to Savages and Demons until I was maybe in my 30s. I was much more interested in the lottery and the horror and the fear. And more proud of it.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting, because in an odd way, I think that kind of replicates the wider critical reception of Jackson, where when there was attention paid to her, what limited attention there was went to the more obviously Gothic material, and the family stories up until relatively recently weren't really considered. They're almost considered slightly separate from that side of things, and not really looked at all. But sorry, I was going into lecture mode there, but I'll pull back. No one wants that. We've just mentioned Stanley there as well, and one thing that's always sort of, I always find really, really interesting and quite poignant is the role that Stanley had in the years between Shirley's death and his own, of course, tragically early death. It was the mid-1970s, wasn't it?
1970.
1970. So not that long, unfortunately. But you did have in the meantime two posthumous Jackson public publications. So we had Come Along With Me, and then we had this one doesn't have a cover, but The Magic of Shirley Jackson. And I'm always really struck. I think that preface by Stanley to The Magic of Shirley Jackson, I think, is one of the most important critical reflections on her ever written. He ends up by saying in the conclusion, Shirley Jackson's work is amongst that small body of literature produced in our time that seems apt to survive, which I think would have seemed like very big words in 1966 when this was published. And yet here we are today, all these years later. And I think it's clear that she is one of the post-war American writers whose work genuinely has survived and is thriving. So what I wanted to do, and I was particularly interested in maybe starting off with you, Laurence, and then maybe Barry as well, and then if anyone else wants to chime in, to talk a little bit about maybe that stage, I guess, of the Jackson legacy very early on, where, of course, no one could have anticipated that she would have passed when she did pass. And then there was the subsequent sort of collecting of works done by Stanley and presentation of Shirley in a particular way. I don't know, Laurence, if you maybe had any recollections about that or thoughts.
Well, there after my mother died, there was a sense of urgency that what she had written should be published, and many of her uncollected stories my father collected for Come Along With Me, a wonderful selection. By no means all. Mm-hmm. We found another 150 to publish after that. But it was a really important collection. And Stanley, let's not forget, was Shirley's editor. Everything she wrote went to Stanley first. Stanley often would read an entire story and put one semicolon in, and that would be it, or one word substitution. And you can tell his writing from hers, of course, in the manuscripts, where suddenly he will make one little correction. But she took his editorial advice very seriously, and he was a huge fan of her work and encouraged her greatly, so that they had a very wonderful symbiotic relationship with writing and editing and deciding really which stories were appropriate to send out, which perhaps weren't ready. Some, in some cases, stories that the world wasn't ready for.
Yeah. And of course, it's at the core of their relationship from the start, isn't it? There's that famous story about how apparently Stanley read her, was it her first or second published story, and he decided that he was going to marry her.
Which a story called Dennis. And it was a one-page story in the Syracuse Literary Magazine, the student magazine.
Yeah, it was the story Janice, was it the girl who's attempted to take her own life? I think was that was the one, wasn't it?
Yeah, she's talking to her friends, and several times she mentions in a very offhand way that she either thought about ending her life or actually attempted it. And it's so casual that it's really uncanny. And in that story, she showed some of her future mastery of the unsaid. And I think that's what appealed greatly to my father.
Yeah, it is fascinating to see a writer who's so much themselves so early on. I think you can see all the, and sorry, my co-organizer Janice has just chimed in to say, great title. And Barry, did you have any thoughts about that period I mean, you obviously, I mean, Laurence too, you would have been very young at the time, but I don't know if you have any thoughts about Stanley's kind of role at that stage.
Well, yeah, I was still living in the house then, those 5 years after Shirley died, before Stanley died. And I remember bringing all the boxes of papers down from the attic and the piles of different things that he had on the table, organizing the stories for Come Along With Me, and his sense of urgency and responsibility. It was very sad, but there was never any question he was going to do it. He had to do it.
Yeah, and in a way, no one would be better qualified. I mean, given his involvement right from the start in her literary development, I suppose. I mean, obviously she was in charge of her own literary development.
Yeah.
But he'd always been, very convinced of her talent, I think would be fair to say.
Well, yeah, those two posthumous books that he edited did a lot. They started the ball rolling, you could say. And then, but really what has made Shirley Jackson's legacy more than anything else is Laurence's tireless work for the last 30 years.
Definitely.
He has just put the time and the effort into it day after day, curating all the possible projects that might be accepted or rejected, and keeping it at that level of artistic quality that is really something to be proud of. Yeah. So I think Stanley started it. Laurence has contributed a lot, but also times have changed. And after World War II, Americans didn't want to hear about horror or ambiguity or anxiety. It was too close to the Hitler and Stalin and the atomic bomb. And yet that was my parents' generation. And so now I think America, at least, and much of the world, I think, is dealing with darker times where anxiety and ambiguity are more prevalent and more understood, and the psychology and the ambiguity and anxiety of women is more understood and respected. So times have changed, and those are the things I think that have gotten Shirley's work the respect that it deserved all along.
Well, I'd like to add that it was just in those times, the late 40s, that Shirley started writing the humorous family chronicles, starting with Charles, but then quickly evolving into other stories, a la Life Among the Savages. And I'd like to say she really loved writing those. She didn't do them for money. She wrote other things for money more. She wrote romantic pieces for the women's magazines of the day,
Yeah.
Charm and Good Housekeeping. And it was a significant support to our household, certainly. But she loved writing the stories about our family. And you can tell in reading them how much she is part of it and how much she plays herself as often befuddled. My father is utterly befuddled in almost every story, but he's there. They were dealing with the realities of raising a family in the late 40s and early 50s. And she invented a whole new genre that has been much copied since, but she was the first one to do it.
Yeah, aptly said. And I think, and of course, she didn't just pen, I guess, kind of versions of your childhood, but she of course had a version of herself, which was obviously very deliberately calibrated to be this very appealing kind of figure. I think I think as in the letters as well, she comes across as tremendously likable, and often harried, always humorous, and there's a real human quality that comes across, I think, really well. I mean, one thing that I'd be curious to know is to why, as members of the family more generally, do you have any theories or hunches as to why? And Barry's actually kind of touched upon this already, but as to why there was this kind of a falling off, I suppose, of particularly critical interest in Jackson. I'm thinking in the 70s and the 80s in particular, when I wouldn't quite say there was a fallow period, but there was a sense that certainly things picked up hugely from the 90s and thereafter, and now of course we're in this wonderful full-blown renaissance. But there were arguably a couple of decades where she just didn't get the attention or the respect that she clearly deserved. And I wondered if any of you guys had any theories as to why that might be, or a sense of maybe why that could be the case. I don't know, Miles or Gretchen.
Actually, it's sort of a side issue, but living here in France, one of the problems with, I think, some of her books on the foreign markets was that they were really badly translated.
Oh.
Many of them were translated sort of as pulp fiction, which with a lot of sort of additional explanations and words that weren't supposed to be there. So one of the things that I've been trying to do over the last few years is to get them retranslated. And as a result of that, they've really taken off here in France, for example.
Oh. That's really brilliant. And has it been different translators or the same translator who's been doing versions of her work?
No, I think the first one was translated by I forget his name, but it's the same translator as James Elroy. And since then it's been done by a few different people. It's really brought about a real sort of a media awakening to her work as a result.
And I know something that Laurence and I talked about a few times during the letters was the fact that it was actually quite difficult to get hold of her work on this side of the Atlantic. Yeah. In the UK or Ireland, you could maybe, if you were very lucky, get a copy of like a film tie-in version of Hill House. But apart from that, you didn't really find Shirley Jackson. That she was quite a difficult. Oh, sorry, Laurence, I interrupted you there.
Yeah, her work was being handled by an agency in New York, which really didn't seem to put much energy into it, and was sort of a passive agency. And it wasn't until the 90s when I got involved that we got all the books back in print. I mean, imagine some of the books weren't really even in print, like Road Through the Wall and Hangs a Man, which I can't imagine. And we established new and very fruitful relationships with publishers, new publishers. And we've been with Penguin Random House now for years, and they've done a great job in packaging her work and repackaging and revisiting often different covers. And then of course the interest starting in the 90s with film adaptations, some good, some not so good, and stage adaptations. And at the moment there are at least a dozen underway. I mean, actually going forward, being scripted, being cast even. So there's an enormous amount of interest in her work, separate and apart from the books. And I think there's some very exciting projects underway.
That's fantastic. And I know that at least one of our questions in the Q&A towards the end might ask, to the extent that you're able to maybe elaborate on that a bit more. And if I could remind our viewers that we do have, you're very free to ask a question in the Q&A box, and we can come to that at the end of the interview part. I don't know if there's anyone else who wanted to chime in on that particular question of kind of, I guess you might call it the Shirley Jackson interregnum or lull or whatever word. I mean, Barry, I saw you had a
Yes.
up there.
Well, I think looking at the historical view, some of the things that have changed, it's feminism is the wrong word. It's a word that neither of my parents would have embraced immediately, I don't think, but a greater consciousness of the psychology of women. I've seen that all through my life, and well, more men respect women, excuse me, or try to understand. And the fact that she both wrote horror or Gothic things and also humor, I think that's easier for our generation to understand. I mean, people now than it was then when it's. So I think the way the world has changed, excuse me, has really helped her reputation. I think the world, I only know America, but the world seems more ready for what she had to tell us than it was in those days when there was still a kind of rose-colored glasses in America, that everything was wonderful. And not too many people maintain those illusions in 2022 that I know.
Anyway, the world has caught up to Shirley.
Yeah. Think about the sundial being essentially a lockdown scenario with an apocalyptic sort of worldview. It's very much in keeping with the way things have evolved.
Although if they had the lottery now in real life in America, would someone object and demand a recount of the ballots? Sorry. Tessie would definitely be saying it wasn't fair. Gretchen, sorry. You have to interject there.
I was just going to say that I also think that her popularity now has a lot to do with Gen Z, Generation Z, and younger millennials loving that sort of retro, Gothic, suspense, horror type of content. Supernatural, all those things are very popular among those generations. And I think especially what's been adapted to film, what's available on streamers has been very popular. And I think that's partly why.
Yeah.
And that's terrific.
Yeah, indeed.
There's almost a kind of a Shirley I mean, this is something that myself and some other Shirley Jackson scholars we talked about at last year's symposium, that there's almost kind of a Shirley Jackson aesthetic now, or like the cat's eye glasses have become iconic, the visuals have become, there's a Shirley Jackson vibe, I suppose.
Yeah, vibe. That's it.
That's right. And it's not just that her writing resonates with audiences now. It's resonated for some time. But, the bottom line is she was a very good writer. She was a craftsman at writing. And you look at her work and it's sparse, beautifully sparse. She said so much with single words. And I think that one of the things that's helped her come back into great popularity is just that the level of writing is so excellent that it's an inspiration to young writers and older writers and people who enjoy fine writing.
It is quite striking if you go into a book, certainly in this side of the Atlantic, if you go into a bookshop, pretty much every second book that is a psychological thriller, if it's a supernatural thriller, definitely if it's got a spooky house in it, they all have in the tradition of Shirley Jackson, or if you liked. Yes. It's almost like it's almost become a little bit, I think, of a publishing cliche, but again, it's a mark of, that association with quality. One thing I wanted to ask very briefly of Miles is, Miles, I'm led to believe that the lottery graphic novel, which I will again was banned in a certain US state. I was curious to ask
several US states.
Several US states. Could you talk about that for a few moments, if you wouldn't mind?
Well, it's interesting. It's been excluded from school districts in Texas and Missouri. I know, maybe others. And it's actually, I'm not going to say it's my fault, but it was due to a sort of a segue that I introduced a bath scene, which for me was actually, let me go back. One of my rules in adapting the story was that it wasn't going to add any dialogue. Some of the omniscient narrator would be turned into dialogue, but I didn't want to add any language. So, and I felt that Tessie needed to be more present in the graphic version for the end to function. Again, because I took an 11-page short story and turned it into a 140-page graphic novel. So there's a 2-page bath scene, which is very, very chaste. There's really nothing suggestive about it, but apparently that's been enough to have the book banned in certain states. But I'm, along with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, those have also been banned. So I'm taking it as a badge of honor.
That's really good company to be in. And so, just to be clear, it's the bath scene. It's
that's what I've, book bans don't come with footnotes or explanations. Unfortunately, I'm led to assume that that's what the problem is. I think part of the problem is also the ending, which again is what makes it so powerful. And I suspect that the bath scene is a convenient scapegoat, and that the end is what really is bothering people, and that of course is the point of it.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Miles. And yeah, I was very curious to know more about that. Unfortunately, we're drawing to a close, and we come to our Q&A section from and again, audience members, please feel free to add your questions to the chat. One thing I wanted to ask all of you as we sort of wrap up this part of the panel is, if for each of you, if there might be anything that you'd like to see happen next as regards Shirley's work and her legacy. You know, I mean, I suppose where next for Shirley, or is there a particular height that she hasn't quite reached, or something, a medium you haven't yet seen Shirley in, although at that stage that's nearly hard to imagine them. I think she's been in most of them. Is there something that hasn't happened yet for her sort of her legacy and her work that you would love to see happen? I don't know, Laurence, is there any, I'm sure you have many things on the back burner, but is there anything in particular that comes to mind?
Well, I do have a lot on the back burner and on the front burner as well. I will say that she's in practically every medium. There's even a wonderful ballet of the lottery that travels occasionally, and it's stunning. It's a 15-minute ballet. So she really can live in any sort of medium and exist very well. As for the future and what I'd like to see, we're doing so many things, but I'm really excited to see that her work translates so elegantly into other forms, particularly stage adaptations and film. And I remember going to see the movie Lizzie with her. Which was based on her novel, The Bird's Nest. And they wanted her to come to Hollywood and she wouldn't go. And then they wanted to have the premiere in New York and she wouldn't go. So they brought the premiere to Bennington, Vermont. And on a Sunday morning, we had the Hart Theater all to ourselves. She said, let's just invite the bookstore people and the librarians. So there were about 15 or 20 of us. And I sat next to my mother. And at first she recoiled a bit, but then really seemed to be fascinated at watching her characters speak her lines. And she wrote, as you know, various reports about having seen the movie, telling her parents, I think, that she didn't like it at all, and telling her agent that she loved it. So, hard to know how she really felt about it. And I ask that myself that often now when we're doing adaptations, would Shirley like this? Or would Shirley perhaps not like this? And she's pretty clear. She keeps me advised.
And I think isn't that where she talks about if they can get the bats out of the lobby or something like that? There's a bat infestation in the cinema. Barry, what about you? Is there anything you would like to see happen, I guess, in the future of Shirley?
There was a movie made of We Have Always Lived in a Castle that I thought was excellent, and it followed the book very well, but it didn't get much traction. I would be happy if that got seen by more people.
Me too.
Perhaps someone could do a better movie of Castle, but I like that one just fine. And I guess a movie of The Sundial, which is in a work in progress, but and it won't be as good as Miles's illustrations, but a well-done movie, an artful movie that follows the book and doesn't imagine all sorts of gratuitous thrills for the audience. That would please me.
No decapitations, hopefully.
No.
Yes, they're absolutely warranted. Although I think there's a scene where someone talks about decapitating kittens in The Sundial, but it's not shown. Sorry. You know the creepy taxi scene? It's really... Yeah.
Don't give them any ideas, Bernice.
No, I assure you that will never make it to the screen. So, back to the movie of Castle. I do feel it's a wonderful movie. I like it very much, but it was completed just as the pandemic was starting in full, and theatrical release became impossible. So we had a smallish premiere in San Francisco. Gretchen was there, thank you. And it premiered at the Los Angeles Film Festival and was very well received there, but it couldn't have much of a theatrical release because of the pandemic. And it just was bad timing.
So I think it's a good reminder for people that it is widely available on streaming. So if you haven't had a chance to see it, it's a really interesting adaptation. I thought, was it Alexandra Daddario, who's quite well known now? She was in the first season of that TV show. Is it The White Lotus?
The White Lotus.
Yes,
Yeah.
she's
I thought
fabulous.
she was a really brilliant Constance. They were both good, but I thought she was particularly fantastic as Constance.
Totally agree.
And Thaisa as Mary Cat was, I think,
That's
marvelous.
wonderful.
I remember watching her get into character every day to develop that slouch, and that's not her at all, but she would kind of gradually assume the slouch, and she'd maintain it all day, and then at the end of the day she'd kind of unslouch and come back to normal.
I see the chiropractor at the end of the day.
And I will say too, on a local note, that the Irish countryside, because it was filmed, I think it was Bray, wasn't it, Lawrence, just outside Dublin, makes a very good stand-in for 1950s New England. So, you know, he played a very small role in that film as a country. And what was there anything else that anyone else wanted to mention before we get into the Q&A? Gretchen or Miles, are you?
Yeah, I think I agree. I'd like to see more film adaptations of her work. And I agree with Barry, Sundial, definitely. And We've Always Lived in the Castle was a wonderful film. And I believe it's on Hulu, Dad, isn't it?
Yes,
Streaming
it
on Hulu?
Yes.
And of course, I'm partial, but I think more graphic adaptations of her work would be wonderful, by me or by other authors. I think it's a lot of her, notably short stories, lend themselves really nicely to visual effects and drawing.
Except I understand, Miles, that you're booked for the next 5 years, so you'll have to get in line.
I'll have to find somebody else.
Thank you so much, everybody. And we have some questions coming in, and maybe I'll ask one of the first ones we have here. And I don't know that I apologize in advance. We have a lot of really great questions, and I don't think we'll have time to get to all of them, though I'll try to do my best. Laurence, we have a quick one for you. Are you sworn to secrecy, or can you at this stage share any details about a possible adaptation of The Sundial, or is that something that's still in the very preliminary stages?
Yeah, I'm asked not to talk about those projects in the works, and I'm going to have to honor that. But I will say that as far as I can tell, each of them is in very good hands. I've spoken recently with the producers and writers on each of them, and all of the novels are currently under option, as are probably 20 of her short stories. And very, very good people are working on them. And I think we're going to very quickly see some very good results.
That's fantastic. It's really great to hear. I have a question from Cindy, and I should say I'm sorry, I forgot to read out the name of the person who asked the first question. I do apologize to you, anonymous attendee, because it's now been deleted, so I apologize. I have a question here from Cindy Wakefield. Did the children, maybe this is one for Barry and Laurence, or maybe Miles and Gretchen can chime in too, did the children really speak as Jackson wrote dialogue in Savages and Demons, so dry and pointed? So is this her dialogue in the stories an accurate reflection of how you guys actually spoke, to your recollection, I suppose?
Well, you know, as I said before, it's kind of hard to differentiate between my own memories of my childhood and the way she wrote me. She gave me some great lines, I'll say that. Some deadpan lines that to this day, I hope I really did say them, because they're great. But there's no way really of knowing. I think she captures each of our personalities quite well. And she maintains those personalities throughout Savages and Demons, and in the many stories that were not in either book, but were published, and some have been collected since then. But I think they're pretty realistic portrayals of the four of us. I really do.
Thank you so much, Laurence. And Barry, did you have anything to chime in on that question?
No, we had to be verbal as children. It was expected around the dinner table. You had to be articulate, but I'm sure she fictionalized it, improved it for the sake of the story.
And I'm sure we'd all wish that we could have our dialogue written by Shirley Jackson. It would be quite something. I have here a comment rather than a question from Emma Alvarez Gibson. Thank you very much, Emma, for watching. Emma says, I read Life Among the Savages at age 7 and introduced my son to the Charles story when he was about that age. He's now 17, and one of us will still occasionally say Charles, and then the other person will say Charles was bad again. so your story has become, or Shirley's story has become kind of a family touchstone. So she's sharing that anecdote and saying thank you. So thank you very much for sharing that, Emma. Here's an interesting question. I'm curious about this one. What did all of you think of the Netflix adaptation? I guess maybe inspired by The Haunting of Hill House, the Mike Flanagan Hill House series. What were your thoughts on that? Did anyone have anything that they wanted to share about their reaction to it? Obviously a very big hit for Netflix. And I know when my own family member said to me, I finally got around to reading Shirley Jackson after watching the series. And I thought, well, if only you'd known someone who'd been telling you to read her for 20 years. But it definitely prompted this person to read Jackson.
My opinion was that it got off to a fairly reasonable start, although it was so far from the original that it seemed more like a sort of original creation based on or inspired by Shirley Jackson. And toward the end, I sort of lost the train of thought. But there were interesting elements in it. I don't know what everyone else thought.
Well, and of course, the lead character is named Shirley, but she's an embalmer, and I thought that was a very interesting way to put her into the series. You know, partway between life and death, transitional. Of course, they attribute her book to someone else, and I'm sure
one of the male characters, which I thought was an interesting choice.
Yes, yeah.
Well,
I'm sure a lot of people went into bookstores asking for that title by the other writer, and
really?
had to be disabused of that confusion.
Oh, well, I suppose that hopefully they ended up with the Shirley Jackson version. What about you, Gretchen? Had you had a chance to watch the Netflix show?
Yeah, I agree with Miles. I started out watching it. I wasn't crazy about the casting. I was thrilled that it actually happened, though, and there was a massive billboard for it on Sunset Boulevard down the street from where I live. So I was just happy to see her name out there, but I wasn't a huge fan of the series, to be honest.
It did bring a lot of people, I think, to her writing, to her novels, however, which is a wonderful thing.
it's a wonderful thing, and it did raise awareness. And I do think that made her sort of, it helped with that trajectory of popularity among younger viewers, especially those who just consume content on streamers.
Definitely. Yeah, and certainly in my own teaching, I've had quite a few students who've come to Jackson through the series. So I think that's, again, is really wonderful. We have a question here from Samantha Landau. Hi, Samantha, fellow Jackson scholar. Samantha has said she's referring back to Laurence talking about Shirley's many musical talents and interests. And Samantha asks, did Shirley have a favorite genre or favorite songs that she played and sang? So I don't know if you had any particular favorite songs or genre of music that she would have been particularly into.
Well, she had interesting musical tastes. She used to sing lullabies to me as a child. I remember that. And later I remember hearing her sing and play the guitar, something she did quite beautifully. But later her musical interests became a little odd. Her favorite music was bullfight music. And often she would dispatch me to the store in New York to buy her bullfight records. And you could tell when she was in a mood because she would play her bullfight music loud in the house.
That's great.
That is fantastic.
Little known fact. We didn't know that.
We have time for a couple more quick ones. We have Erica Ross. Hello, Erica. Thanks for tuning in. Erica asks, in Shirley's letters, she often writes about reading mystery stories. Do you have any recollection of which authors or franchises of mystery stories she was particularly interested in?
Oh, that's hard. She read voraciously, as did my father, of course. That he read for a living. But she would buy mystery stories and always tear the front cover off because they were tawdry. So there were bookcases full of paperback mystery stories that she'd read, all of them missing the front cover. And I would go looking through them, trying to find something to read. And it was extremely frustrating because, of course, all I would get would be the blurbs on the first text page, and never having seen the covers of any of them. But she just consumed those. I don't know. She read Victorian literature as much as she read contemporary. She loved all kinds of writers, and I'd be hesitant to name one or another.
Yeah, I know that something that we were editing the letters volume, that she mentions it quite a lot, that she's reading a certain genre, but she doesn't always say what. She very rarely actually says the particular book that she's reading, which is interesting. I think this, because we're coming to the end, and I know that Miles in particular, we've got people who have to leave us. So just to end on this question, I think would be, and I apologize to everyone whose question we didn't get to ask. We have some great questions, but I just haven't had time to come to them. So I do apologize. This is a question from Emma. I think it's a nice note to end on. What do you think Shirley would say about the revival of her work's popularity?
I assume she'd be thrilled.
I'll jump in if no one else wants to. I think that she would be very pleased and wryly amused.
Yes.
Barry, what about yourself? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, she would be chuckling. Yeah, Laurence has got it exactly right. She'd be pleased, but also kind of a little snarl in there.
Sort of a I showed you in the end type thing. Well, I think that wraps it up really nicely. A little snarl from Shirley. It's been such a pleasure to chat to you all here today, Barry, Gretchen, Miles, and Laurence. We so appreciate you taking the time to talk to us, and it's been an absolute pleasure. I know I've enjoyed it, and I hope that our audiences have. So thank you so much, and goodbye.
Thank you, Bernice.
Thank you,
so much.
Bernice.
Very much.
Thank you very much, Bernice. You've been a great help, and a wonderful help with the book of letters. Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. Absolutely. On both cuts. Thanks, guys.